Genesis chapter 2, verse 8. It explains that the Lord God planted a garden eastward in Eden, and there he put the man whom he had formed. As you guys know by the title of this video, you can have a basic understanding on what I'm about to explain. The Garden of Eden is translated in the Hebrew as the Garden of God's pleasure. In Eden, the Hebrew translation of Eden is pleasure. An alternative way of saying the Garden of Eden is the Garden of God. So, after God created Adam, he placed him in the garden that was planted eastward in Eden. This garden was the spiritual manifestation of the pleasure and the gloriousness of God's majesty. Adam was experiencing an eternal bliss alongside with Eve until we all know the story and we all know how that ended up. But this story always sticks out to me for some reason. What I'm about to explain to you guys is a very, very interesting way of viewing this story. Trust me. It's significant even our lives. So in Genesis chapter 3, it says, "Now the serpent was more subtle than any beast of the field which the Lord God had made. And he said unto the woman, Yea, hath God said, Ye shall not eat of every tree of the garden? And the woman said unto the serpent, We may eat of the fruit of the trees of the garden, but of the fruit of the tree which is in the midst of the garden, God hath said, Ye shall not eat of it, neither shall ye touch it, lest ye die." So you can see that Eve was obviously informed on what she was not supposed to do. Possibly it was from Adam or from God, more than likely from both. So they had understanding. They had an intelligence of some sort. They knew how to comprehend information. They were not lacking. They were fearfully and wonderfully made, as the word states. But this is what I'm saying now. God made us with free will, but we were not aware of our free will until sin entered the picture. And it is this understanding that Adam and Eve were not aware of, the range in which it could be extended to and perverted. So, what would cause them to realize this understanding that they have this free will? Because, remember, they weren't living in an actual... A lot of people will say that, as I was mentioning, with the Garden of God's pleasure, that it must be somewhere, right? It must be located somewhere. There's a lot of debates about the origin of it, if it's in this country, that country. The truth is, it wasn't even a physical place, but it was a spiritual manifestation of the Lord upon the earth at that time. But Adam and Eve, never being exposed to the earth, are being exposed to that type of environment, their consciousness was only adapted to the grace and to the love of God, to his peace. That it would take something or someone that was entirely opposite to trick them, to deceive them. So just bear that in mind, that they were under the influence of God's bliss. That was their consciousness. It was connected to God. Now it says that, the devil continued to try to entice her. And he said that, For God doth know that in the day ye eat thereof, then your eyes shall be opened, and ye shall be as God, knowing good and evil. This was straight to verse 5. I'm reading straight. I skipped over verse 4. And this is the part where I want to really highlight and explain thoroughly. It says in verse 6, and when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was pleasant to the eyes, and a tree to be desired to make one wise, she took up the fruit thereof, and did eat, and gave also unto her husband with her, and he did eat. So, I didn't want this to be a long audio. I didn't want this to be a long recording. But based on this, what I want you guys to understand about God's love for us is that He gave us free will in the intention that we'll continue to abide underneath His love and care, knowing that it's only meant for our protection, mentally and spiritually. Although, succumbing to even listening to the deception in any form of the enemy, that alone is enough to awaken and to activate the ego inside of us. We all know the complex that's called the ego. I don't really want to get too complicated into that, but the ego was something that was already inside of Adam and Eve, believe it or not. It was inside of even the devil. Because when you actually read the book of Isaiah, and Isaiah was actually explaining at one point that Satan was a glorious angel. He was a cherub of God. He was so loved and beloved by God. You understand? He was one of the most beautiful angels, archangels in heaven. And he was such a sight, and he was holy at one point, but something happened to him. Something happened to him that caused him to recognize this free will that he had, that activated the ego complex inside of him. And in activating this, it is irreversible. That's why God said that the day that he eat, and apparently there was even more additional urgency. God was starting them even more with this command, because Eve said that they couldn't even touch it. So what that really shows is that how far and how far-reaching deception can really be once it enters your mind. Once you allow that psychological wall to be broken or to be open, you can't reverse that. It's very, very difficult to mount back a defense. And just listening to those slick words, the sly persuasion of the enemy, that was all she needed. That was all Adam and Eve needed for their ego to be activated. And you see now what happened is that in the next verse, it explains that on the eyes of them, because they ended up eating it, both of them, and she took of the fruit thereof and did eat, and gave also unto her husband with her, and he did eat. And the eyes of them both were opened, and they knew that they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves aprons. What you guys have to understand, that connection to the consciousness, the divine consciousness that they were presenting, that they were experiencing in Eden, the garden of God's pleasure, was now lost, because they activated something inside of them, that because they were made from soil, and because the enemy was already, he already activated his ego, this created a compromise in the spirit and also psychologically. So their consciousness now was no longer connected to God's bliss and peace. It was connected now to the worries about who is looking at them. Immediately they are saying to themselves, who is seeing me? I'm naked. I have to find something to cover up. This is exactly how powerful this thing is. It's an awakening that you cannot reverse. You cannot reverse this thing. This is why God created us with free will, because he's not controlling. That would be against his love, against his character. But he didn't intentionally, explicitly impose or put us in a direction for us to exercise his free will against him, because he knew if we had done that, it would be ultimately to our demise. It would be ultimately to our demise. Because this consciousness that was ultimately now carnal, it was made carnal, it was no longer spiritual, it is now physical. It created an ultimate shift in that environment. That's why they had to be kicked out of that state. They had to be placed outside of the Garden of Eden. And God punished them for it, for rejecting his bliss, his spiritual comfort. They rejected that for physical attachments and worry and sickness and grief and pain and stress. All of these things is really deep. So guys, I hope you understood this message. I hope you share this audio with someone else, someone that you love and care about. Hope you have a good night. God bless each and every one of you. Take care.